Good morning, it's Ms Francine, or Ms Fran, you can call me, on the Peace and Understanding with Ms Fran channel of YouTube, which I've designed for grown-ups, but also for teens and even tweens who just have lots of questions about life and are ready to prepare to grow up and are wondering what's ahead and what the world is like and why there's how they can be fair and good in a world that too often isn't. So today I'm going to take a deep dive into this book called The Festival of Esther, the Story of Purim, retold by Maida Silverman, illustrated by Carolyn S. Ewing. And I think these illustrations look really nice. Now I'm going to, on each page, there's always something to talk about. First of all, there's a lot of, I think, beautiful art, and you can see this is set a long time ago, or else in a faraway place, or both. And you can see from this, I think this is an ox cart, that's another clue that it's either in a faraway place or a long time ago, or both. So as we read, I'm going to talk about what we're reading, but let's start. Long ago, a king named Ahashuwaris ruled a land called Persia. Okay, so I have read through the book, so I know from looking at the picture several times that this is Ahashuwaris. Well, you might have figured that by the way he's sitting, and he's got all these attendants, and he's sitting on this fancy chair that looks like it might be a throne, and he's got kind of a fancy setting for the ancient world or for a faraway place, and there are a lot of people that look like they're attending a feast. So you might think, well, sure, that's the king. But later on in the story, you're going to hear about another person who thought he was very high and mighty, and he wanted actually everybody to bow down to him, a different person. Because, kings and queens, well, they have courts with lots of nobility. So is this the king, or is this nobility who wants to be as close to being like the king as he can possibly get? Well, you have to read the story to tell. Pictures don't give everything away. For those of you whose kids are becoming beginning readers and independent readers, that's something to keep in mind, that looking at picture books is not a cheat sheet. There's a lot of things to wonder about. And that means that looking at pictures can help a child to want to read the story. Now, this, of course, is a story that I'm sharing, first of all, on the Peace and Understanding with Ms Fran channel. That's because I don't believe in censorship. I said that the last episode. Oh, today is March 29th of 2022, by the way. But I do believe my Peace and Understanding with Ms Fran channel is all about how parents and kids can discuss difficult issues together. So there's a difficult issue in the story of Purim. Now, a king named Ahashuwaris ruled a land called Persia. Well, that alone brings up several things, because you see, Persia is the land that is modern-day Iran. And you might have known about Persia as a place where there are Persian carpets, and they look really fancy, kind of like... Oh, I have moved my books around so much, so I'm going to have to do a little moving. But you might have known of Iran as a very war-torn region, but Persia was thousands of years ago. I want to show you a picture of some Persian art, not this, we keep going, to my bookmark. Okay, this is Persian art, and there's a whole article about it. Look how lovely it is. That looks like somebody who might be a king. So, Persia was a very advanced civilization Oh, they had wars and stuff. There's a guy with a shield. I don't know if he's going to war or if he's hunting a tiger, or I don't know. My guess is he's hunting a tiger. But it was a very advanced civilization. Didn't mean that they didn't have wars in ancient Persia. They had a big war against the Greeks. That's where you might have heard about Thermopylae. This guy, Ahashuwaris, was the mastermind behind the attack on the Greeks and Thermopylae, if you remember, if you've ever studied ancient Greek history. But right now, let's read on. Now, this first paragraph has a lot to unpack. So we learned that this is probably a picture of King Ahasuerus. We learned about the land called Persia, modern-day Iran, and many Jews had come there, and they lived with the Persians in peace and harmony. Well, it looks like everybody's having a good time. As for the Jews coming from many Jews had come there. Well, people move around to lots of places, and they have throughout human history. And there's a lot to think about there. There's how we treat immigrants, how we celebrate Thanksgiving. That has to do with people coming to a place when they were very hungry and looking for a new home. And was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Can you say it was a little of each? I talked about immigrants when I talked about the potato famine and on St. Patrick's Day several days ago. And there are lots of people from lots of different countries. In fact, Jews later came to America. But when somebody comes to a place, how do the people already there react? Do they learn? How did the Jews and the Persians learn to live in peace and harmony? Well, there are lots of stories behind that. And of course, there are Bible stories, and there are other things written about antiquity. I think there's an ancient Greek writer who wrote about the Persian Wars. There are modern historians that write about it. So that's sort of a way to think about ancient history when there's not a lot of stuff written about it, but when there's not a lot of stuff that was written at the time, but there are a few things written at the time, and there are a lot of modern books about ancient history that you can read, and there are more and more kids' books about it. For instance, if your kid was moving on towards the end of elementary school into middle school, they might study different countries. They might learn about those countries' ancient histories. Perhaps the country that they'll pick to read about is going to be somewhere in the Middle East, and they'll learn that Middle Eastern ancient civilizations might have often looked something like this at the royal court, but not always for ordinary peasants. Like, I don't know if any of these are ordinary peasants. He's on a horse, so I guess not. So I don't know if we're going to see pictures of ordinary peasants or not, but we're going to find out the story of this picture as we continue on. Okay, so King Ahasuerus, we're pretty sure that this guy is King Ahasuerus. Okay, one day King Ahasuerus gave a banquet for all the people in Shushan, his capital city. So we looked at this picture a lot. That's maybe the banquet. When the merriment was at its height, the king wanted to show off the beauty of his queen Vashti. He ordered her to appear before his guests. Now, this is still March, Women's History Month, so I want to talk about women standing up for themselves. And Vashti stood up for herself. She's not really as well remembered as Queen Esther on the cover here, who did something very brave. But Vashti is a woman who stood up for herself. She did not like to be ordered around as if she were a servant. She refused to obey the king's command. Now, servants probably also don't like to be ordered around, and people that work out in the fields or building bricks, which is something I'll come back to later, they probably like it even less. But, well, maybe Vashti thinks that because she's the queen that she shouldn't get ordered around, but everybody else should. So maybe she's not such a nice person. Doesn't talk much about Vashti, but in the Purim story. But you can find out about Ahashuwaris. also known as Xerxes when he attacked the Greeks in the Persian Wars, and Ahashuwaris, Xerxes, and his first queen, Vashti. King Ahasuerus, was furious that Vashti wouldn't come out and let King Ahasuerus show her off to his guests. "Not even the queen may defy me," he cried, and he ordered Vashti banished from his kingdom. Think that's a picture, a drawing of Vashti being banished from his kingdom? Well, she gets a ride out, but is she going to get a ride all the way back to where she's supposed to land up? I don't know. Things could get hard for her. I don't know. We don't know much about her story. Could be interesting to read her story. I think that it's pretty gutsy for anybody to say no to a king under any circumstances, because kings are so powerful. Okay, so what happens next? What's in this picture? King Ahasuerus decided to find a new queen. He sent for his officers. "Find the fairest young woman in my kingdom," he said. Or, "Find the fairest young women in my kingdom," he said. "Bring them to the palace. I will choose the one who pleases me most and make her queen." Okay, these are the guys with the swords or pikes, and so I'm guessing these are the officers. This is some little girl and a grown woman and an older grown woman, and this guy's wearing a bright orange hat. Let's find out what's going on. Among those chosen by the officers was a Jewish girl named Esther. She was an orphan. She didn't have any parents to raise her. She was an orphan who lived with her cousin Mordecai. He had adopted Esther and raised her as if she were his daughter. Do you think that this might be Mordecai and Esther? Or maybe is this little Esther and this is some other lady? And who's this lady? Well, only pictures don't give these things away, so we'll read on. But this is a picture. Do you think that's King Ahasuerus? That looks very much like a king's crown. Lots of pretty women. Maybe these are the women that King Ahasuerus is going to look at and choose among for his wife. Things weren't always very fair to women in those days. Well, okay. For those of you who are grown-ups and older kids, you probably know things were very unfair to women for a long time. But a good way to introduce the story to younger kids is to maybe show them just the pictures and say, okay, so maybe start the story here. There was a king, and he was looking for a new queen. And then come up to Esther being this, and tell them that this is Esther. You have to read ahead in the story to be able to tell them this. This is Esther, and King Ahasuerus chooses her for his queen. All right, but it says here, if you want to read in more detail, Esther, did not care about becoming a queen. She did not want to leave her cousin and her home. "You must obey the king's order," Mordecai told her, and so Esther was taken away to the king's palace. Many young women were brought before King Ahasuerus. None pleased him, but when he saw Esther, he fell in love with her beauty and gentleness and chose her to be queen of Persia. Okay, what do you think she looks like there? A little nervous and scared, maybe in her eyes looking up at him. She's begging him to be kind to her. Maybe she feels like she's falling in love with him. There's a lot of things to think about when you look at a picture, especially a picture of somebody's face. Faces can be very mystifying sometimes. And what do you think he's thinking? He might think, well, this is the right queen for me, but do you think he feels a very kind of love, a very gentle kind of loving love? I sure hope so. But we're used to kings just feeling like, oh, this one will do a lot of times. So we're going to find out more about the story of Esther and her being queen of King Ahasuerus. Okay, what's going on here? Looks like, since I've read more, I think this is Mordecai. And you can tell kids that are younger, instead of reading all of them, you could just say Mordecai was the king's scribe. He wrote letters for the king. He sat in the palace courtyard, and he and Esther sent messages to each other. So that way, he and his cousin Esther could keep in touch, and he could understand more about what's going on inside the court, which is something Esther now knows about. Now, who are these people who are having a conversation outside? Well, we're going to read about that, but since I read ahead, you can tell kids that Mordecai was was working for the king, and he heard some bad men plotting against the king, and that means they were planning to do something bad to the king. And you could just leave it at that for little kids. Of course, what they were planning to do was to murder the king and take over the throne. Mordecai quickly sent a message to Esther. She told King Ahasuerus about the plot, and the guards were punished. Well, it says here the guards were punished. I think they might have gotten the death penalty. It doesn't say that, but I wouldn't be surprised. That's pretty common for anybody that plots to murder a king and take over his throne, or even some smaller noble and take over their throne, like, say, a duke or an earl, or we don't hear about dukes and earls in this book, but if you know about royal families, countries with royal families tend to have these things. Well, Mordecai had saved the king's life. So there's Mordecai. So I think we've decided this is Mordecai. Who's the guy going by on a horse? Well, you could tell little kids, okay, Mordecai helps the king because he writes letters for the king, and then the king signs them with his royal seal, and they're rolled up like this. This is what you could tell little kids. And then he hears some bad guys talking about doing harm to the king, so he gets a warrant. So he sends a warning to the king, and the king is very glad that he got the warning. But then the story continues on. This is another bad guy, is what you could tell the kids, and this guy is Haman. And when Jews celebrate the story of Purim, this is the story of Purim, they celebrate how Haman had a bad plot and it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work was because of Mordecai and Queen Esther, who talked to the king about this guy Haman's bad plot. And anytime you hear the name Haman, Jews celebrating Purim, they use noisemakers. I don't really have a good noisemaker, so I'll just pound on the desk. Or I don't know if you want to let your kids make little raspberry sounds like that's kind of between you and what your family does, but that's why this is on the Peace and Understanding with Ms Francine channel instead of going right to the kids channel. But yeah, you could just say to kids, well, there's another bad guy. Boy, a lot of bad guys. See everybody bowing down, and this guy wasn't bowing down, and so Haman, the bad guy, look at him wagging his finger at Mordecai, who helped the king before against these other bad guys. Well, why is he wagging his finger? He's wagging his finger because Haman, the bad guy, wants Mordecai to bow down like this. Now, this is a very important part of the story. And this is probably, well, if your kids are really little, you can just say that Mordecai goes on to foil other bad guys, but that he doesn't do it alone. You could say Haman makes everybody sad or scared. There's a lot of sad and scared people. You could say that to little kids. But he's talking to Queen Esther. You could tell the kids he's talking to Queen Esther about this bad guy, Haman, and how he makes everybody sad or mad and upset. So Mordecai is talking to Queen Esther about it. Queen Esther goes and talks to King Ahasuerus. There's King Ahasuerus, but he looks angry. And do you think she looks scared? Ask the kids, how can you tell if she's scared? Well, you're going to have to read a little bit. I think the best thing to tell the littlest kids is nobody's supposed to talk to the king unless the king sends them a message saying that it's okay, or sends them a message saying the king wants to talk to them. But nobody's, otherwise the king gets really mad, and there's the king getting really mad. Now, for big kids who are old enough to understand, it's a little more complicated. Esther, even though she's the queen, you're not supposed to do anything to defy the king. Remember how much trouble Vashti got in this early picture here? Well, it all started when these bad guys were plotting to kill the king. Remember, we talked about that. Mordecai overheard them, and he saved the king's life by telling Esther to tell the king. Well, ever since Haman came around and wanted everybody to bow down, Mordecai wouldn't bow down, and Haman was very angry. You read a little bit of this with the older kids. "Who are you?" he demanded. "How dare you stand when all must bow down to me?" All must bow down to Haman because Haman was King Ahasuerus' chief advisor. Except for the king, he was the most powerful man in Persia. Everyone had to bow down to him when he passed. One morning, Haman came to the palace. Everyone bowed low except for one man who stood straight and tall. Okay, so that's when Haman gets very angry. And Mordecai says, "My name is Mordecai. I am a Jew. Jews shall never bow down to men as if to worship them." That's something that is against Jewish belief, and probably the belief of many other faith traditions as well, but never bowing down. Okay, why is everybody sad and scared? Well, with the older kids, you can explain. This is a very important page. Mordecai's words filled Haman with hatred and rage. So you can tell the little kids Haman makes people sad and scared, and there's a picture of people being sad and scared. But with bigger kids, it's important to know he plotted to kill all the Jews. He said, "I will revenge myself upon the Jews," just because he had his feelings hurt. So he was a bully. Well, kids who are older are learning that bullying needs to stop when you're a kid. If you don't stop bullying when you're a kid, and you don't stand up to bullies or report bullies to somebody like a teacher or a grown-up who cares, then the bullies will just keep on bullying, and they might grow up to be bullies. And that is exactly what happened with Haman, and it happens with a lot of people who have power to this very day. So at some point, I think this is very important to talk to kids about, and about how you need to be brave and stand up to people. Well, Haman was a sneaky bully. Haman hurried to see the king. "There are people in Persia who ignore your laws," he said. "They are a great danger to your kingdom. Let me deal with them." Well, King Ahasuerus often left important matters to Haman and believed what he said. "Do with them as you think best," he replied. So Ahasuerus, he's the king. He's busy giving lots of parties and doing the fun things that come with a king's job. But the serious things, he's just leaving to Haman, his chief advisor. He trusts his chief advisor, but maybe he shouldn't trust him so blindly. That's something to tell kids to think about. Do you trust people blindly? How do you know when you can trust somebody? Well, when kids are younger, they should stick with what their grown-ups at home tell them, and perhaps their teachers at school. When kids get older, well, then they start to form friendships, and there can be peer pressure. Sometimes you got to say no to peer pressure. You got to say no to bullies as you grow up to be a bigger kid. This is kind of something that happens with grown-ups too, and not only with grown-ups, but it happens throughout human history. And this is a period in human history. This period is almost 2,500 years ago. But plots to kill people, groups of people. This is very important. This is what's making the people. There's somebody reading the news, and it looks like these are the people who are being targeted, the Jews of Shushan, Persia. I know because I've read the story. Well, there are a lot of times in history, it's not just in the ancient times, but it's to this very day when people get targeted, even targeted to be killed because of who they are or what they believe or how they look or things like that. It's called genocide. It's something, I don't know, I think probably to teach kids about as they approach adolescence, but that's between parents and kids. It really depends on the situation for a kid. If a kid has known this kind of hatred or knows somebody who knows this very deep level of hatred. So this sounds like Purim is going to be a very sad story. Well, this is where Queen Esther comes in. Remember, I said that Mordecai, he knows about this, and he's talking to Esther about it. He says, "You are the Queen of Persia. Go to the king and beg him to spare us." She says, "I dare not go unless I am summoned." Esther told him, "Whoever does so now is put to death." Whoever does so now. So Esther was able to tell Mordecai about, or was able to tell about this earlier plot to kill King Ahasuerus. That's important. There's a lot of plotting to kill in this book, so that's why you might want to save it for bigger kids. But it's important to talk about these things, and it's important to talk about when somebody has to risk their life. Esther was an ordinary girl, remember? When she came to the king's court because he summoned her, and she didn't even want to go, and she didn't even want to be queen, and she became queen even though she didn't want to. Well, she goes anyway because it's to save her people. Okay, so there she is pleading with the king, and knowing that even though she's the queen, he could still put her to death. Royal families have often had a lot of murder and intrigue within them and throughout history. So there are a lot of bad people doing bad things, but Esther is a good person doing a good thing, and so is Mordecai. Esther knows that she needs to risk her life to stop this terrible Haman from carrying out his plot to kill all the Jews. This is Haman, and we're going to see more pictures of Haman. There's Haman. Well, Esther is very scared. Being courageous means that you do what's necessary to make the world a kinder place, a safer place, a fairer place, even though you're scared. And that's a very difficult thing to teach kids. But if your kids have ever had to say no to peer pressure or bullying, or hopefully report when somebody is harming somebody, that's something that grown-ups have to do too. And you have to be brave. And if the person keeps up, well, it looks like Haman is keeping up. I'm going to read you a little bit of the story of Esther according to one of the recountings of it. Now, the best known recountings are different Bible recountings. So I'm not trying to push religion at you. In fact, this recounting comes from a Christian Bible because Jews and Christians both share the story of Esther. This is, well, it doesn't say, but there's an ad for Bible Gateway Plus. I think it might be New International Version. It's some version that's not with all the fancy these and thous. It's not the King James Version. Well, Esther is scared. Remember, she says that all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces, the wide-flung lands, know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter, so that he may live. Esther continues, "But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. Now here comes the really cliffhanger of the story. This is where Esther has to decide whether she's going to be brave and do the right thing. And Mordecai told the messengers to reply to, well, the messengers told Mordecai what Esther had said. Remember, Mordecai is the guy in the bright orange hat for the purposes of our story. That's how this story has him pictured. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house, that is all your family, it's kind of ancient for all of your family, will perish, just like everybody else. You're not special. You don't get to stand aside and be a bystander." And then this Bible story, it's the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 14. Well, when it says, if you keep silent at this time, you can still be doomed. But it says relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. If you keep silent, you are doomed, and a lot of other people are doomed too. And you are the one who's allowed it to be possible for them to be doomed if you keep silent. How can you keep silent? And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And then Esther decided she was going to talk to Mordecai, or talk to the king, even though she's very afraid and even though she faints away, and the king catches her in his arms, and he truly loved Esther, and he said, "Why did you risk your very life to see me? Whatever your request, I promise to grant it." Okay, so Esther did a very brave thing. She really is a woman, I think, who should be featured for not only Purim, which happens sometimes in February and sometimes in the month of March, but also for Women's History Month during the month of March. Of course, March is almost over. I've gotten busy and behind on my story sharing, but women's history can really be any month, any people's art. This is Asian art. Of course, there are a lot of books about European and American art, and there are books about Asian art, about art from different continents, Africa, South America, Aboriginal Australia. Art can be any time. Anybody's history from any time and place can be any time. Women's history is not just for March. Black history is not just for February. There are so many things from those time periods that I wanted to talk about during the months of February for Black History Month and March for Women's History Month, and I just ran out of time. And that's why, well, I guess I feel a little extra motivated to say that things don't have to just be celebrated in different months, but also it is because people sometimes say, well, why do we have to set aside time to, why can't we just do European history, or why can't we just do all the great men of history? There are plenty of great men of history. We do them all year round. Is 1 month really so much to ask? What if we scattered, or there are a lot of famous, Caucasian white people. Esther looks kind of white, but and so does Ahashuwaris, but they're Middle Eastern, so they're a little darker than, say, somebody from England or Ireland. Say, remember we did Ireland for St. Patrick's Day. Ireland is a country that your kid might study about. They have old traditions, new ones. It's possible to study any country at any time. I think I showed you you grown-ups a travel book about Ireland briefly. You may or may not get to travel to a distant country, but get interested in different times and places and people. And just do it all year round. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to read you the next part of the story about Purim after Esther told the king Ahashuwaris here, that Haman was plotting against the Jews, and that even though he had kind of said, okay, Haman, whatever, even though Ahashuwaris here had said, okay, Haman, whatever, do what you want, and the Ahashuwaris wasn't really paying attention the first time, Esther tells him that now she really needs to pay attention. She doesn't actually tell him it's Haman. That comes later. We'll find out. She just tells him that the Jews are in trouble. It's probably smart that she doesn't just say Haman's going to kill all the Jews, because remember, Ahasuerus trusts Haman. So she's going to tell him in a way that's going to make him have to rethink what and whom he trusts. So Ahasuerus is going to have some figuring out to do, even though he's the king and he may think he knows everything, or that being the king is just about getting to dress fancy and have a good time. Maybe Ahashuwaris will have to think again about what's important to him, even though he's the king. Esther sure had to think again about what's important to her. She wanted to just kind of be in the woodwork and not be noticed, at least according to this story. And sometimes an ordinary person has to rise to the occasion. We see that in real life. We see, I'm really upset about what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and ordinary Ukrainians have had to do this just to be brave and either get themselves and their children to safety or stay back and keep the Russian army from advancing on the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, and taking over. And they have to be brave to keep their country's freedom, because in freedom there's safety. When somebody's always telling you what to do, well, that's how bullying starts. Like Haman. Boo. Okay, so Ahasuerus, anyway. So people have to make decisions that really involve being brave, paying attention, not just being caught up in their own concerns. And these two people, they did. They had to stop thinking about just what they needed and think about the greater good. And we're going to pick it up from there.